Welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in to learn some Jewish history together. So last week we covered the Dreyfus Affair, and in a moment we'll discuss what that had to do with the rise of modern Zionism. But first, I want to give a picture of what was going on in the land of Israel at the same time that the Dreyfus Affair was happening in France. So just a quick summary of some of the things we covered in previous weeks. Already after the Spanish expulsion, there was a small trickle of Sephardic Jewry that went back to the land of Israel, mainly in the city of Tzfat and a little bit in Jerusalem as well. In the 18th and the early 19th century, the descendants of, or the students of the Hasidim, the students of the Baal Shem Tov, went to the land of Israel, and on their heels were the students of the Vilna Gaon. Now, all of that is what is often referred to as the old Yeshuv, the old settlement. Now, that wasn't so small in number. That was a group that numbered maybe 25,000 by the period we're coming to discuss tonight. But we're going to discuss how that plays in with what is often referred to as the new Yeshuv or the First Aliyah. So in 1881, again, up until this point, it's about 25,000 Jews in Israel, mainly in the four holy cities of Jerusalem, Tzfat, Tveria, and Hebron. And at this point, most of them are Ashkenazim. The Sephardic community is pretty small. And the Ashkenazim are pretty much evenly split between the Hasidim and the descendants of the Vilna Gaon, or the students of the Vilna Gaon. In the 1880s, we have the beginning of the Zionist movement in Russia take effect. The Chovevei Tzion, as we discussed last week, a movement known as BILU, which was an acronym for Beis Yisrael L'chul V'nelcha, which means the Jewish people get up and go. And with all the anti-Semitism that was going crazy in Russia that we've really discussed in all its depressing detail, there was with the millions going to America, there was a push to go to Eretz Yisrael, to go to the land of Israel as well. Now, when we talk about Russia at that point, if anyone had really understood the writing on the wall that within 60 years, 6 million would be eradicated by Hitler, another 2.5, 3 million would be eradicated by, or at least philosophically eradicated by communism, everyone would have gotten up and gone. But there was a large number that went to Israel, to America, and the small trickle that went to the land of Israel. The group that goes to the land of Israel is known as the First Aliyah. Now, this is the first of what is usually counted as 5 waves of Eastern European immigration to the land of Israel. And what's interesting is what this group finds when they get there. Now, first of all, they find the 25,000 Jews that were already there. Those 25,000 Jews were living in a country that was a backwater part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at this point is the sick man in Europe. It's a decrepit empire. The French, the British, the German are all postulating to try and take the land of Israel over because of its religious significance. But meanwhile, as it's under the control of the Ottomans, it's backwater, it's underdeveloped, it's malaria-ridden, it's barren of trees. They had the Ottomans at this point had cut down almost every tree that remained in the land of Israel, or that was in the land of Israel, and whatever remained from that will be cut down during World War I. So when the British take over in the midst of World War I, there will be virtually no trees in the land of Israel. And we can understand from this the concept of, we'll talk about JNF shortly, and the concept of building trees in Israel, or planting trees in Israel, and what the importance of that was, because every tree you see in Israel today was planted by hand and is no more than maximum 120 years old, many much younger than that. So it's not a country that's easy to live in. And just to put into perspective, Mark Twain, the famous writer, actually visited the land of Israel in 1867, and he writes on his trip to the country, he said, again, it wasn't called Israel yet, it was called Palestine in those days, but he writes on his trip, he says, the further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrubbery anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. And that's, you can trust them because it's not Jewish, right? But that's what the land of Israel looked like. Now, this makes a lot of sense because our prophets tell us that, yes, the land of Israel is in a not the most hospitable of climates, but it will only sprout for the Jewish people. And it definitely sprouted during the First and Second Commonwealth, and we've seen it sprout again in this time period of the Jews resettling it. Now, under the Ottoman control, and the Ottomans had been in control of the land of Israel for about 400 years, and the Muslims had been in control, again, with the back and forth of the Crusaders, but the Muslims had basically been in control at this point for 1,200 years, including the 500 years of the Ottomans. But never under Muslim control, at least before this point, were there more than 200,000, maybe 250,000 Arabs in the land of Israel, because it was just not a very hospitable place. There were much more hospitable places to live in the Ottoman Empire than Palestine, than the land of Israel. And many of those who inhabited the land of Israel were the Arab Bedouins, the nomadic people that would come in, come out. And it was never, ever, ever a capital city, never a significant part of the Ottoman Empire or any other Muslim empire. So it's very important to keep that in mind, especially when we talk about the modern landscape and the modern political issues that have arisen in the land of Israel. So at this point, when we're going to have, over the course of the First Aliyah, we're going to have maybe 25,000 Jews come to join the 25,000 Jews that are already there. So we're going to have about 50,000 Jews by the time everything's said and done at the rise of the 20th century. And that's going to be compared to about 250,000 Arabs, which we'll see will go up to about 400,000. And let me explain why. So let me first put this into just a little bit further perspective, that the amount of Arabs in the world right now, which the Arab world is basically the Ottoman Empire. Okay, a few other places not part of the Ottoman Empire. Egypt wasn't part of the Ottoman Empire. There are a few other countries that were not. But for the most part, it's the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Middle East, this region of the world. And in the year 1800, there are about 91 million Arabs in the world. And by the year 1900, there's 200 million Arabs in the world. So out of that 91 to get 100 to 200 million Arabs, roughly during their population growth during the 19th century, at that time, there's going to be less than 0.00015% of the Muslim world that will live in the land of Israel. So it is not a significant part of the Arab Muslim world at all. Now, hand in hand with those roughly, let's say, 200,000 Muslim Arabs, there were also about 43,000 Christians, most of them Christian Arabs, that were also in the land of Israel. Again, there were some European Christians as well, but for the most part, they are Christian Arabs. Now, the Christian Arabs are oppressed by the Muslim Arabs, but they all team up to fight against the Jews when they get there. Now, the Arabs were made up basically of two classes. There was what was called the Felachin, which are basically the Arab serfs. Now, these were basically slaves that worked for absentee landlords from other parts of the Arab world, from Lebanon, from Syria, Iraq, etc. And, there was no oppression of Arabs like was done by their fellow Arabs. And even that still is the case today. And so the Felachin were like the serfs, the working class. And there was also a middle class. There was an Arab middle class that had started, at least even though the place was underdeveloped, but they had made small towns like Jaffa and Nablus and other places, small towns, and it was this middle class that was the most threatened by these now 50,000 Jews that were inhabiting the country. But they used the Felachin as their pawns to take up the fight against the Jews because they were an exploited people. So it was easy to make the Jews a scapegoat and blame their downtroddeness on the Jews. And that's going to really be the case until today, that the Arabs living in the land of Israel are going to be pawns of the rest of the Arab world to turn on and make the Jews a scapegoat for their downtroddenness, when really the situation is very much perpetrated by their Arab brethren in other countries. Okay, now, one thing we do have to say, we really have to be intellectually honest about this. Whether, wherever we are in our with our feelings on Zionism, whether we're pro-Zionist, whether we're part Zionist, whether we're anti-Zionist, wherever we are, we have to look at the Arab question and be intellectually honest about it. That at no point from the rise of modern Zionism was there ever a proposition on how to deal with the Arabs that were living in the land of Israel. Because even though that what started as 200,000 was insignificant to the rest of the Muslim world, no one else in the Ottoman Empire cared about them. it still was significant for them because it was the place where they had been living for several hundred years. So when the Palestinians of today talk about this had been our land for hundreds of years, we're going to see not necessarily so. Yes, a lot of them are descendants of those 200,000, but we'll see that a lot of them come as the Jews come to the country because there's opportunity for Arabs too. But be it as it may, that is a reality, that in a country of, in a small backwater country that's populated by about 200,000, and all of a sudden you have these Eastern Europeans moving in and say, well, it's our land, and they just kind of finesse the problem. And even Herzl himself, when he would talk about the Arab question, he would say, essentially, they're going to be so thankful to us for building the country. Their land value is going to go up. They're going to have health care. They're going to have education, et cetera, that they'll be happy to be part of the Jewish state. Well, all that is true, that their property value went up, that they got the opportunity for health care and education and everything that the modern state of Israel brings, yet they still aren't happy because they are the scapegoat that we mentioned before. So that is really how the Zionist movement thought they would deal with the Arab problem. The Arabs would be happy to be part of this wonderful Jewish state that was being built. And it is a wonderful Jewish state, but the Arabs are not happy to be part of it. At least most of them are not. Now, when we refer to this group as the First Aliyah, it's a little bit of a controversial term because, as we said, their numbers only match the group that was already there. Like, why aren't the descendants and the students of the Baal Shem and the Vilna Gaon called the First Aliyah? Or the Sephardic Jewry called the First Aliyah? Or we mentioned the people who came with Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. Why aren't they called the First Aliyah? Okay, whatever. It's a controversial point, but we have come to call it the First Aliyah. Now, the people who were there, we mentioned, were called the Old Yeshuv. The people who were coming now in the First Aliyah were, unlike the Old Yeshuv, was all religious Jews for the most part, and most of those coming in the First Aliyah were secular socialists. They were secular Zionists. Again, the term Zionist hadn't really been put into use yet, but they were secularists, just running away from the terrible situation in Russia. And now they call themselves the New Yeshuv. And just like they weren't so happy with the Arabs in the land, and they kind of finessed that problem, they also just kind of finessed the problem of the fact that there were 25,000 Orthodox Jews already living in the land. Now, one main difference between the ideology of the First Aliyah and the ideology of the Old Yeshuv was the First Aliyah was an agricultural settlement. It's often referred to as the agricultural Aliyah, and their goal was to really build up the land, make it self-sustaining, make the Carmel winery from Rothschild, and make the kibbutzim, etc. The Old Yeshuv survived almost predominantly on tzedakah, on charity coming from Eastern Europe. So that was a little bit of a clash right there. But the goal of the First Aliyah was really to make the land self-sustaining. Now, besides these Russians, Eastern Europeans who came to the land of Israel, there's also a group of Yemenites who came. The Yemenites will be the first really from the Arab world that will come to the land of Israel. The remainder will come after the founding of the state of Israel when they'll be kicked out of the Arab countries. But the Yemenites will come. And there is still, until this day, a small Yemenite community. There is they're known as, we call it Yemen, but the Jewish name was Taiman. So we call it the Taimani community. And what's interesting about the Taimani community is Jews settled in Taiman after the destruction of the first temple. Most other communities in the world date back to the destruction of the second temple, but the Taimani, the Yemenite community, was almost unadulterated from the first temple. So a lot of times when we look at the Yemenite community, we think of that as probably the most authentic version of Judaism in many ways. Not to say other, the cultural shifts of the Ashkenazim and Sephardim and other groups isn't authentic, but we look at what they are doing as probably the most similar to what Jews were doing after the destruction of the first temple. And, many of their customs differ slightly from other groups. They've adopted some cultures from some customs from other groups, but the pronunciation of Hebrew is very different than both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi pronunciation. And again, it's probably the most authentic. It's probably the real Hebrew. Anyhow, so of this first Aliyah, as we mentioned, it was a very difficult terrain they came to, very difficult lifestyle. Everything was difficult about it. We think about Israel today. It's a very developed country. You almost don't have to give up any creature comforts to move there, or to visit there, or to live there. But back then, even compared to the terrible situation in Russia, you were giving up a lot to move to the land of Israel. So many gave up because of disease, hunger, and just the situation. Now, this will all really exacerbate the question that we'll deal with with in the coming sessions about pre-war Europe or after World War I, but pre-World War II Europe, the rise of Hitlerism and Nazism, and how the writing was on the wall for Eastern Europe, but where were the Jews to go? We're going to see it gets a little easier in Israel, but the British will come in and make it harder. America closes borders. England closes borders. That's a question that we have to start asking now as Jews are trying to get out of Eastern Europe. And we'll see there's never an answer. And Hitler is the one who hears that louder than anyone when he comes up with the final solution. Now, one of the mistakes of the First Aliyah, and it's a self-proclaimed mistake, is that as they get to the land of Israel, they hire Arabs to do a lot of the dirty work for them. In other words, to do a lot of the building, to do a lot of the farming. They hire Arabs, and those Arabs are paid much more than the felachin, than these serfs who were working for their brother Arabs, the absentee landlords. And this is why, as we see the population of Jews in Israel go up from 25,000 to 50,000 and so forth, we're going to see just as the Jewish population will double every 10 to 20 years up until the founding of the state, we're going to see the Arab population doubles as well. Again, they were coming because of the opportunity provided by the Jews. Yet they didn't want the Jews on their land from the beginning, on what they claimed to be their land. And that's just it's a logical, intellectual point that you'll never win in debate because many in the world today don't want to realize it. But the reason that many of the now what we call Palestinians, which today number 4 million, who come to the land of Israel, their descendants, their antecedents, are not from the original 150 to 200,000 who've been there for quite some time, but they're more from the hundreds of thousands that will come, up to 1 million will come before the founding of the state, who come. So we go from basically under 200,000 to 1 million in the next 50 years, and they all come for the opportunity provided by the Jews settling the land. Let's not forget this point. It's often not made, but it's a very important point. Now, the First Aliyah in many ways didn't go as planned. They run out of money. Like we said, the terrain was tough. There was a lot of disease. There was a lot of malaria. There was a lot of problems, and the First Aliyah got this idea in their head somehow that as they were trying to go through the reforestation of the country, that eucalyptus trees were going to be a great supplier of wood for the country because eucalyptus trees grow very quick. They'd help drain the swamps. So that's why throughout the land of Israel, especially in the Galilee, which was really where a lot of this group will end up, they plant a lot of eucalyptus trees. Now, apparently, eucalyptus tree wood is good for absolutely nothing, but that's why you see a lot of eucalyptus trees in the land of Israel. There's also the famous story with Eli Cohen, the Israeli spy to the Syrians, but that might be apocryphal. It probably is apocryphal. We'll get to that later, but it's probably an apocryphal story. The one who really at least gives some breath of life to the First Aliyah is, again, Baron de Rothschild. We mentioned last week the concept of Al Cheshbon de Baron, how Baron de Rothschild pays essentially for the whole country at this point, opens the Carmel winery. He buys or helps the First Aliyah purchase about 350,000 acres of land because that was the mindset that we're gonna essentially force the state of Israel by buying land, settling land, and there's going to be so many Jews there, no one's going to have a choice but to make it a Jewish homeland. Now, by the way, I always use the term Israel because that is the biblical name of the country. Even though in the first Commonwealth already, the country splits into two, called Israel and Judah. And during the whole second Commonwealth, the country is never called Israel, it's called Judah or Judea. And even at the founding of the state in 48, it was unknown until the Declaration of Independence on May 14th, 1948, or Hayir, 1948, as to what the state would be called. It would be called Judea, would it be called Israel, would it be called something else altogether. So when we call it Israel, I'm using the biblical name and the modern state name, but at this point, it's called Palestine by everybody, and even as the Jews discuss making a Jewish homeland, they're not sure what they're going to call it yet. Now, some of the famous settlements that were founded already at the time of the First Aliyah were Rishon LeZion, First of Zion, great name. That was really the first settlement founded by the First Aliyah. The Rosh Pina up in the Golan Heights, up in the Galil, Golan Heights, somewhere up there. We have Zichron Yaakov, which is near Haifa. It's wine country. It's where a lot of the great Israeli wine comes from. And Petach Tikva, near what will become Tel Aviv, then called Jaffa, and these are just some of the early settlements. There's many others, Kfar Saba, some that aren't as well known, but those are some of the ones that still exist today as major cities, and they date back to the First Aliyah as Jewish settlements. Okay. At this time is when the political Zionism takes form. Now, the intellectual forefather of political Zionism is none other than Theodore Herzl. Now, Theodore Herzl enters the scene as the Paris correspondent for the Neue Freie Presse, the New Free Press, which was a Jewish paper from Vienna, which is where his family lived. Now, his family was originally Hungarian, but had moved to Vienna, and Herzl was a Renaissance man in more ways than one. He was trained as a lawyer, practiced law for some time, but his passion was always writing. He was a beautiful writer and a beautiful orator, which is a lot of how he gains his success and fame. Now, Herzl was in France during the Dreyfus affair, and covered the Dreyfus affair as most press did, and he writes himself that the Dreyfus affair is what turned him into a Zionist, because he watched the situation. Now, I had to mention, he was a completely secular Jew. He did not have a bris milah. He did not have a Hebrew name. His father was a secular Jew. His grandfather was traditional. So he was already 2 generations down the path of Haskalah, of secular Judaism, or secularism, or whatever you want to call it. So he was not a passionate Jew in any way, shape, or form, and he was bothered by the Jewish question of anti-Semitism, and he felt really before this point in his life that the answer was, as many of the Haskalah and the secularists at this time felt, that the answer was give up your Judaism. If you would give up your Judaism, we wouldn't have these problems anymore. If we would give up our Judaism, we could be Frenchmen, we could be Germans, and we wouldn't have this problem. Just get rid of Judaism. That's really what Herzl felt. Now, he writes that as he witnessed the Dreyfus affair going on in France, and this was France, the first country where Jews were emancipated, the home of so much culture. Like, if there's anywhere where there was a great test case for Herzl's original theory, it was France. And as he sees the Dreyfus affair unfold, he sees that there's something just wrong with that philosophy. It doesn't work. That here, Dreyfus is a secular Jew, and a country where most Jews are secular Jews, and the whole thing becomes about Judaism. As he's marched out to Devil's Island, they chant death to the Jews. It sets off a wave of anti-Semitism, as we talked about in last week's session. And Herzl writes in his later writings that witnessing the Dreyfus affair is what turned him into a Zionist. Now, this might be a slight revisionist history, because it seems that Herzl was already a Zionist before the real movement of the Dreyfusards even started, and before the public started to realize the atrocity that had been perpetrated to Dreyfus. And we even see in Herzl's early writings that predated the Zionist movement, and in the early writings of the Zionist movement, that there's barely a mention of the Dreyfus affair. There's barely a mention of what was going on in France at that time, and Herzl even wrote that he, like most of France early on in the trial, thought Dreyfus was guilty. Right? Dreyfus was a horrible witness. There was a lot of suspicion around him because of just the way he was, and Herzl thought he was guilty too, until the Dreyfusard movement starts and the real anti-Semitism starts in response to that, and it becomes a Jewish issue. So the main influence early on in political Zionism was probably more Karl Lunger, who was the mayor of Vienna, who was an anti-Semitic demagogue, and he rose to power in 1895 in Herzl's home Vienna, and it was shortly after that when the Zionist movement was solidified in 1896, 1897. So even though in the wake of Dreyfus, that'll add fuel and steam to the Zionist movement, but we see the Zionist movement is already taking shape long before the whole Dreyfusard movement really takes shape to support Dreyfus in France. So, okay, probably just a bit of revisionist history perpetrated by Dreyfus himself. In late 1895, Herzl writes his first major Zionistic work, a book known, or a pamphlet known as Der Judenstaat, which translates as the State of the Jews, the Jewish State. And it was published in February 1896. And in this book, it laid out his plan to form a Jewish state. In other words, he claimed, or he felt that, like we've beaten the point solidly in this course, that Europe, at least Eastern Europe, and now he felt even Western Europe, was done for the Jews. And therefore, the only way the Jews could ever be safe from the anti-Semitism they had faced over the past several hundred years was to make their own state, where they could have their own country, their own culture, they could live amongst themselves, and there'd be no room for anti-Semitism because it would be a Jewish state. Now, Herzl did not initially feel this had to be Palestine. He did not feel this had to be Israel. He felt it could be anywhere. We had early movements to make Jewish states. Like there's a famous Jew by the name of I'm blanking on his name, I'm sorry, but who tried to make a Jewish settlement near Niagara Falls called Ararat. And there were many others that were attempted. Galveston, Texas was once proposed to be a Jewish settlement. So the concept had come up before. Moshe Emanuel Noah was his name, who tried to make Ararat. Anyhow, the concept of a Jewish state somewhere had come up, and that's really what Herzl was pushing for at first. Now, he said Palestine would probably be a good place because he was familiar with the Chovei Tzion movement that had started in Europe, and he said they'd be likely allies, and he said no one's really there anyways. Again, glossing over the about, 200,000 Arabs that were there and 25,000 Jews that were already there, but he said probably be the best location. So he writes out the whole plan in the Judenstaat, and this was really the beginning of the idea of Zionism taking shape. Now, because of the secularist he never really thought that the Jewish culture would be a culture of, learning Torah, observing the Torah, going to shul, keeping kosher, because he didn't know from any of that. Even though his grandfather was a traditional Jew, he wasn't raised with it at all by his parents. And even though in Vienna he lived next door to the Doheny Street Synagogue, which was the biggest synagogue in Europe at the time, still he had just no insight into the traditional Jewish community. So nowhere did he think that was going to be the Jewish culture. And he didn't even necessarily think this was going to be the Jewish culture of the Haskalah, like the Yiddish theater and all that stuff. No, he thought they'd form their own culture. He felt it would really be based on German and French culture because he looked at the German as the culture folk, as the culture people, and he thought that was what would be created in the land of the Jewish state. As far as language, he never thought for a minute it would be Hebrew or even Yiddish. He thought the language would be French because that's what the majority of Western Europe spoke at that point. So this was, as his vision was building, this is where it was coming from. But as he laid out in Der Judenstaat, he felt that by Jews coalescing, getting together, and by the way, it was Mordechai Emanuel Noah, not Moshe Emanuel Noah. I had to hear my notes later on. But as the Zionist platform starts to take place, the idea was to have a land, the Jewish culture, and there was basically a schism, I guess, in the early Zionist movement between what Herzl was creating, what was known as political Zionism, and another idea called practical Zionism. So political Zionism that Herzl was advocating for and that he will work for the next 5 or 6 years of his life before he passes away to achieve was that the powers of the world would be lobbied about the Jewish problem, the Jewish question, the anti-Semitism, the fact that Jews had nowhere to go, and the powers of the world would charter the land of Israel for the Jewish people. That was really his idea, and he spent his whole life. He'll meet with Kaiser Wilhelm numerous times. He'll meet with many of the officials of the Ottoman Empire. He'll meet with the British officials and even Russian officials to try and get the nations of the world to sanction the land of Israel for the Jewish people. Now, the other side of the Zionist movement is what we call practical Zionism. And this is the idea that if Jews move to the country and build the country, then a state will develop around those that group. So modern Zionism really be a collision of both ideas, political Zionism and practical Zionism. But in the initial meetings and congresses of the Zionists, they will be in conflict in many ways. Now, Herzl spent his whole life, as we said, trying to lobby the powers of the world. He met with the Kaiser numerous times. The Kaiser actually made trips to Israel. The Kaiser felt that Israel would become a German colony when the Ottoman Empire fell. And that's why there's a neighborhood in Israel today called the German colony. That was really settled by the Kaiser. And if you ever wondered why when you go into the old city of Jerusalem today, you go in through Jaffa Gate, really considered the main gate, I guess, of the city, there's a little gate on the side, but then there's this opening opening in the wall. Well, the reason for that was because when the Kaiser first came to visit Jerusalem, the Kaiser had a big tall horse, and he was a big tall man, and he wore a big tall German military hat, and none of that could fit through the gate of Jaffa Gate, and there was no way the Kaiser was going to get off his horse or bend his head. He was a man known for his modesty, but there's no way he was going to do any of that, so he had a opening made to the side of Jaffa Gate so that he could get through. Now, today that's been used for us to be able to drive taxis and buses to be able to get into the city, but that was originally made for the Kaiser to be able to get into the city. So Herzl meets with the Kaiser. He'll meet with the Ottoman officials. Now this will be after the Armenian massacre in the Ottoman Empire, which was a terrible atrocity perpetrated against the Armenian people. And Herzl's proposal was, well, if you would do this for the Jews, you would sort of sympathize with a downtrodden people. It might help you to clean up your image in the world after what you did to the Armenians. That was one of the arguments that Herzl made to the Ottomans. Now, Herzl actually at one point did get an audience with the Sultan Abdulhamid II, and at this point, with the Ottomans' tremendous debts and just tremendous financial problems, he proposed that the Jews of the world could consolidate that debt of the Ottomans and to make it more manageable and with a lower interest rate, and to hopefully give some better financial footing for the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. And in exchange, the Ottomans would give this little, piece of land that 0.000, whatever I said before, percent of their people live on. Now, the Sultan did not go with this idea, but the idea did gain a certain amount of traction within the Ottoman Empire, but Sultan never went with it, so that one never got off the ground. Herzl also tried to meet with the Vatican. He tried to get support of Pope Pius X, and he even got a meeting with one of the cardinals, Cardinal Raphael Mary de Val, and he stated that the church's policy could never be to recognize a state for the Jews, because, especially in Palestine, at this point, Herzl agrees it should be Palestine, but because the Jews denied the divinity of their savior, of Yeshua, then the Catholics could not make any declaration in favor of the Jews. So, again, Germans doesn't go too far, Ottomans doesn't go anywhere, Vatican doesn't go anywhere, but the ones who really do take up, to a certain extent, Herzl's cause are the British. And he gets a hearing from Joseph Chamberlain, who will be the infamous Prime Minister of England at the onset of World War II, famous appeasement policy with Hitler. Talk about him more later, but he gets a certain amount of traction from within the British Empire. Now, part of that is because of the Rothschilds, and part of that was because there's a wonderful book by Barbara Tuchman called The Bible and the Sword, which talks about the affinity of the British going back for a long time to the land of Israel, and he gets a hearing in the British Empire. Now, Joseph Chamberlain will propose that you want a Jewish state? We'll give you Uganda. Uganda was a part of Africa controlled by the British at that point. The idea was to take some part of the British Empire that was the most far-flung, no one wanted it, no one was interested in it, and give that to the Jews. Now, Herzl was fine with the idea of Uganda, and he will even present it at the Zionist Congress the year before he passes away, and he'll be in favor of it, and he'll say it's a temporary solution. We'll go there temporarily, we'll build a country, and then eventually we'll keep working on Palestine, and we'll get to Palestine. Now, the Zionist Congress before his death is going to pass a motion to explore the Uganda Plan, and then it will essentially die with Herzl, and at the next Zionist Congress it'll be firmly rejected, and that'll be the Uganda Plan. Now, Herzl also tried to lobby Egypt to make a settlement in the Sinai Peninsula, close to the land of Israel. Egypt won't go for it. So he tries anything and everything, again, through diplomacy, through political maneuvers, to get a Jewish state off the ground. Now, he gains that kind of respect in the world because of the grandeur that surrounds him, the support he's given within the Jewish world, and the respect he's even given to a certain extent in the non-Jewish world. That he is going to be treated in all these places as a statesman, even though he's representing no country in any way, shape, or form. Now, we mentioned a few times already the Zionist Congress. The first World Zionist Congress takes place in 1897, a year after essentially the Zionist movement is kicked off with the book, the Judenstaat. We're going to see really how quickly he gets this movement off the ground. And remember, this is before social media, this is before the television, this is before the telephone, like this is before a lot of inventions that would make getting a message out to the world easy, but he gets it out very quickly. And in 1897, he launches the first World Zionist Congress, which 200 delegates from across the world, many from Zionist organizations representing all countries that had Jewish population, they all come to meet at the First Zionist Congress. Now, he tried throughout Europe to find a hall for this Congress, and no one would rent him a hall. Finally, he convinces the Swiss to rent him a hall, and the first Zionist Congress takes place in Basel, Switzerland. Now, 9 out of the first 22 conferences that take place before congresses that take place before the founding of the modern state will take place in Basel. The other 13 will go to other places. But the Zionist Congress takes place almost every year leading up to World War I. It doesn't happen during World War I. It takes place many years between the wars. Obviously, it doesn't happen during World War II. After the founding of the State of Israel, there's still a Zionist Congress that takes place every 4 to 5 years and always in Jerusalem. And talk to someone who's involved with it who can tell you what they actually achieve or do. I'm not quite sure, but it's the World Zionist Organization is the organization, and they just had the Zionist Congress a couple years ago, I think last year or 2 years ago, and it still goes on every 4 to 5 years in Jerusalem. Now, because Herzl had done such a good job in such a short time getting this message out to the world, the Congress is covered by international press, and it makes a very significant impression on the whole world through the publicity that it inspired, and it also, like any time you see the Jews doing something good, there will be anti-Semitism that will be sparked from it as well. In fact, the Zionist Congress is actually the impetus for the infamous book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's really where the idea originally comes from, for the press that surrounds the First Zionist Congress. And it was attended, as we said, by 200 delegates from all over the Jewish world. And at that speech, Herzl was elected as the president of the Zionist Congress. And he got up and he said in almost prophetic words at that Congress, he said, if I said this out loud today, which he was saying out loud, if I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. And what was it that he said? His statement was, today I have founded the Jewish state in 1897. And the prophetic part of his words was that he alluded it might only take 5 years if we're lucky, but it won't take more than 50 years. And sure enough, 1947 will be the partition plan. 1948 will be the founding of the modern day state of Israel. And that was one of the prophetic statements that came out from that first Zionist Congress. Now, the idea of JNF, the Jewish National Fund, or Karen Kayemet, as it's called in Hebrew, was presented at the first Zionist Congress, but it won't be established till the fifth Zionist Congress. And the idea was to raise money throughout the Jewish world, little blue charity boxes, to purchase the land of Israel. It was the practical Zionist idea that we'll just go and we'll purchase it from the people who own it, and that's what we're going to build the state. And the original blue pushka, if you will, was actually Herzl's hat. He took off his hat and passed it around at the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1901, and that was the beginning of the Jewish National Fund. Now, there was opposition to modern Zionism, a lot of opposition, for sure in the secular world, but even the Jewish world. First of all, as we mentioned before, the Reform movement vehemently opposes the idea of modern Zionism. There were exceptions, as we mentioned before, Abba Hillel Silver and others, but for the most part, the Reform movement as a movement will oppose Zionism until after the founding of the State of Israel. Now, as I think I said last week, they really, since then, have gotten their just desserts, so they're having a very hard time gaining footing in the land of Israel. It's like the murderer of a parent saying, have pity on me because I'm an orphan. Crazy idea. Now, the other group that was in opposition was the strict laborists. They thought that the Communist Manifesto was going to work as the Communist Manifesto takes root. But also, many factions of the Orthodox community were not happy with the first Zionist movement. First of all, they they saw the secular involvement as just a desecration of the land of Israel, a desecration of the Messianic vision, which was really driving this at its core. And also, there is a famous statement in the Talmud in Kesuvos that talks about how the Jews should not force the redemption, so to speak, should not force taking back the land of Israel from the nations of the world. And in truth, a lot of these secular leaders will do a lot to alienate the Orthodox community that's in the land of Israel and that's in Europe throughout the Zionist movement. So the reconciliation is really, in many ways, it's been finessed, but yet to come between the secular Zionists and the religious Zionists and even the religious community. But one of these days, hopefully it'll be worked out. Now, Herzl himself has a very tragic life. He works tirelessly for 8 years on the Zionist movement and then tragically dies at the age of 44, penniless, because he has spent every penny that he had on the Zionist movement. And we're going to see even his family. He did not have a very happy marriage. He loses one of his children to sickness. One of his children converts to Christianity and Catholicism and tries a lot of different religions. Eventually, before he dies, he says that I die as a Jew. But not a very happy life in any way, shape, or form. But, he's an unlikely hero coming from this very, 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 very secular upbringing that he had. And to really, we have to give credit to him, whatever you think about him. But we have to give credit that he was really the one in those 8 years that formulated the idea of the Zionist movement and got it off the ground. And if it wasn't for him, who knows if there would even be a state of Israel today. And like I said, no matter where we are on the political spectrum, I think we all agree that the state of Israel is a good thing for the Jews, and we all benefit from it. Nowhere has Judaism flourished like it has flourished in the modern state of Israel, with yeshivas and with a real Jewish culture, not the one that Herzl had in mind. Yes, it has its problems. We're going to discuss the problems. We're going to attack the problems in coming sessions. But we have to give credit where credit is due to Theodore Herzl as being the visionary that made a lot of this come to fruition. I thank you all for joining us tonight. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.